The new kid walked into his high school with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He had just moved to the area, leaving behind his old school, his friends, and the life he had known. His name was Malik, and despite being only 16 years old, he already had to navigate the weight of his family's past. He had been told to keep his head down, blend in, and stay away from trouble. As he stepped into the school, Malik's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard rumors about this place, stories of cliques, social ladders, and how difficult it could be for someone new. He had grown up in a world that wasn't like other kids his age. His father, a successful businessman, had a reputation that stretched far beyond the local community. Most people didn't know what Malik's father truly did for a living, but those who did stayed out of his way. Malik, however, wasn't interested in his family's reputation. All he wanted was to have a normal high school experience, make some friends, and get through the day without drawing attention to himself. He wanted to be seen for who he was, not for his last name. He arrived in the middle of the school year, a time when the other students had already formed their groups, their friendships, their inside jokes. It wasn't easy being the new kid, and it felt even harder for Malik, knowing that he didn't fit the typical mold of a high school student. On top of that, he was black in a school where most students weren't. He wasn't blind to the fact that his appearance was going to stand out. As he made his way through the halls, he felt the stares, some curious, others colder. Some students whispered behind their hands as he passed, and Malik tried his best to ignore it. He didn't want to start anything. He just wanted to get to class. But the stares kept coming. Some felt like judgments, others like outright challenges. His first class was history. Malik took a deep breath as he stepped into the room and found a seat near the back. The teacher, Mrs. Kelly, smiled warmly as she welcomed him. She seemed nice, but Malik couldn't shake the feeling that all eyes were on him. He sat quietly, trying to stay out of the spotlight. It wasn't long before he noticed the group of students who seemed to be the most interested in him. They were loud, always laughing, always making jokes. Malik didn't mind people joking around, but he could tell there was something about their attention toward him that felt a little too sharp. They were the type of people who could turn anything into a joke at someone else's expense, and Malik quickly realized that he might be their new target. He wasn't surprised, but it still hurt. These were the first moments he had in this new school, and already he was beginning to feel like an outsider. He tried not to let it bother him. His mother had always told him that people's opinions didn't matter as long as he stayed true to himself. But being in a new place, facing new challenges, it wasn't always easy to live by that advice. The bell rang, signaling the end of his first class, and Malik gathered his things, trying to make his exit as unnoticed as possible. But deep down, he knew that this was only the beginning. He had no idea how much harder things were about to get for him, or just how much courage he would need to get through it. For now, though, he just focused on the next class, hoping things would get better soon. As the days went by, Malik quickly realized that the new school wasn't going to be as easy as he had hoped. While the teachers were nice enough, and some students smiled at him in passing, the tension in the hallways was undeniable. It felt like everyone was talking behind his back, and Malik couldn't escape the feeling that he was always being watched. But it wasn't just the stares. The real trouble started when a group of students, led by a guy named Jake, started targeting him. At first, it was small things. Malik would be walking to class, and he'd hear Jake and his friends whispering or snickering as he passed by. Malik would try to ignore it, but the constant noise in his ears made it hard to forget. Sometimes they'd say things about him under their breath, comments about his clothes or the way he talked. Nothing that could be considered outright bullying, just enough to make him feel uncomfortable. One day, Jake decided to test how far he could push things. It was just another typical lunch period. Malik sat at a table by himself, trying to enjoy his food. He hadn't made any friends yet, so he preferred the solitude. As he chewed on his sandwich, he heard the footsteps approach. He didn't even need to look up to know who it was. "Hey, Malik," Jake said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Malik didn't answer, hoping that if he ignored him, it would go away. But Jake didn't let up. "You sure you don't need any help with your lunch?" The other students around them started to chuckle, and Malik's stomach turned. He knew this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to deal with. He forced a smile, trying to stay calm, but his heart raced in his chest. "I'm good, thanks," Malik said, not looking up from his lunch. His voice was steady, but he could feel the heat rising to his face. He hated how easy it was for Jake to get under his skin. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him upset. But Jake wasn't done. He leaned over the table, his face only inches away from Malik's. "What's the matter, Malik? Don't want to talk to us?" His tone was mocking, and the words hit harder than Malik would like to admit. Malik set his sandwich down and looked up at Jake for the first time, his eyes meeting Jake's with a quiet intensity. He didn't want to make a scene, but he also didn't want to be pushed around anymore. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I don't have time for people who think it's funny to make others feel small." Jake blinked, clearly taken aback by Malik's response. For a moment, the laughter in the air seemed to die down, and the students watching exchanged curious looks. But Jake quickly recovered, giving Malik a sly grin. "We'll see about that." The group of bullies walked off, their laughter fading as they left Malik at the table. He felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was short-lived. The damage had already been done. He knew it wasn't going to be the last time they targeted him. It wasn't the first time he had been treated this way. But this time, it felt different. Malik was no stranger to the whispers, the judgment, and the glances that came with being different. But being the new kid, especially one from a family with a history like his, only made things harder. He knew that his race and background would be used against him in ways he couldn't control. Still, there was something inside him that refused to back down. He wasn't going to let them break him. As he finished his lunch in silence, Malik made a promise to himself. This was only the beginning. He couldn't let them get the best of him. He would rise above it, even if it took everything he had. The bullying didn't stop after that lunch. In fact, it seemed to get worse. Jake and his friends started making more pointed comments, trying to push Malik into a corner. They would bump into him in the hallways on purpose, laughing as if it were all just a game. Malik did his best to ignore them, to keep walking without letting it show that their words were getting to him. But it wasn't always easy. One afternoon, as Malik was making his way to his next class, he heard the familiar footsteps behind him. Before he could even turn around, he felt a sharp shove to his back. It wasn't a gentle push, either. It was forceful, like they were trying to make a statement. Malik stumbled slightly but caught himself, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose his balance. "Watch where you're going, Malik," Jake said, his voice cold and mocking. The group of bullies behind him snickered, enjoying the reaction they got from him. Malik clenched his fists at his sides, but he didn't say a word. He didn't want to give Jake the pleasure of seeing him upset. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and kept walking toward his class. But as he rounded the corner, he felt another shove, this time even harder than before. He turned quickly, his heart racing. It was a different student, one of Jake's friends, who had decided to join in. The laughter echoed around him. And for a moment, Malik felt like the whole school was watching. His face burned with embarrassment, but he refused to let them see how much it was affecting him. He stood there for a second, unsure of what to do. He had learned from his parents to never escalate things with violence, but the idea of letting them keep pushing him around was unbearable. Still, he reminded himself that giving in to them wouldn't change anything. He was better than this. "Stop pushing me," Malik said quietly, his voice steady. He had no intention of backing down, but he also didn't want to make a scene. He just wanted them to leave him alone. Jake's friend scoffed, leaning in a little too close. "What are you going to do about it, huh?" He taunted, his words laced with arrogance. Malik felt the anger bubbling up inside of him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He was learning quickly that getting angry wouldn't solve anything. It would only give them more reason to laugh. Instead, he just turned around and walked away, keeping his eyes straight ahead. As he entered the classroom, he could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just Jake and his friends anymore. It felt like everyone was watching him, waiting for him to snap or to do something reckless. But Malik kept his head down, not letting their expectations get the best of him. Sitting down at his desk, he tried to focus on the lesson, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the events in the hallway. He thought about his mother's words, how she had told him to rise above it, to stay strong, and to never let people like Jake define him. It was easier said than done, but Malik knew that she was right. For the rest of the day, the comments and stares continued. It felt like he couldn't escape them, no matter where he went. But in that moment, Malik made a decision. He wasn't going to let them break him. He was stronger than their words, and no matter how hard they tried, he wasn't going to give up. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Malik was exhausted, physically and emotionally. But as he walked out the door, he carried a quiet determination with him. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. As the days passed, Malik felt the weight of the constant bullying wearing him down. It wasn't just the insults or the shoves that got to him. It was the feeling of isolation. No matter how hard he tried, it seemed like he couldn't fit in. His classmates kept their distance, and whenever he did try to talk to someone, there was always that unspoken tension in the air. He felt like an outsider in a world that was moving on without him. One evening, after a particularly rough day at school, Malik was sitting in his room, his mind swirling with everything that had happened. He was angry, frustrated, and confused. His father's world was one of power, influence, and respect. Malik had always been told that his family's name commanded attention, but now, at school, he felt like nothing more than a target. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. On one hand, he wanted to distance himself from the drama. But on the other hand, he knew that his father's world had the potential to change things. It wasn't until that night when Malik overheard a conversation between his parents that he began to realize just how deep his family's influence really went. He had always known that his father was successful. No one in their neighborhood would dare mess with him. But he didn't fully understand the extent of his father's power until that moment. Malik was lying in bed when he heard his parents talking downstairs. He knew he shouldn't listen in, but curiosity got the best of him. He quietly stood and crept toward the staircase, careful not to make a sound. From his spot, he could hear his father's voice, calm and collected, as he spoke with someone over the phone. "He's under my protection," his father said. "Anyone who crosses him will regret it. Tell them to back off before things get out of hand." Malik's heart raced as he listened. His father was a powerful man, someone who was respected or feared, depending on who you asked. But what struck Malik the most was that his father wasn't just talking about business or money. He was talking about him. Malik leaned against the wall, his mind racing. He had always known that his family had connections, but hearing his father talk about protecting him was a whole new thing. Malik wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of him felt relieved, like he had a safety net, but another part of him felt uncomfortable. He didn't want to rely on his father's power to solve his problems. He wanted to handle things on his own. After the conversation ended, Malik sat quietly in his room, trying to process everything. He knew his father's world was dangerous, full of secrets and shadows, but it was also powerful. He wondered if, just maybe, he could use that power to stand up for himself. But as the days went on, Malik made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to use his family's influence to get back at the bullies. He didn't want to be someone who relied on others to fight his battles. Instead, he wanted to prove that he could handle things on his own. Even though the bullying continued, Malik's resolve grew stronger. He didn't need his father's connections to fight his battles. He could do it himself. But deep down, he knew that his father's words weren't entirely wrong. Sometimes, having powerful people in your corner could make all the difference. As Malik faced each new day, he tried to keep his head up, no matter how hard it became. He didn't have to fight back with fists or power. The real challenge was learning to rise above the hate, to stay true to himself, and to show everyone that he wasn't going to be broken. His strength came from within, and that was all he needed. The days seemed to blur together, each one feeling much like the last. Malik was starting to lose track of time, consumed by the daily cycle of school, the bullying, and the moments when he could just breathe for a few seconds. But even as things remained difficult, Malik could feel something changing inside him. He had endured a lot, but he had learned to hold his head up high. Still, something deep inside him told him it was time to make a stand. He couldn't just keep ignoring the problem, hoping it would go away. It was only getting worse. It all came to a head one afternoon in the schoolyard. Malik was standing by himself, leaning against a tree, when he saw Jake and his friends approach. The group had been making his life miserable for weeks now, and Malik could feel the tension in the air as they drew closer. This time, it wasn't a small shove or a whispered remark. It was different. He could tell something bigger was coming. Jake was the first to speak, his usual sneer plastered across his face. "What's the matter, Malik? You still upset about the other day?" he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. Malik didn't respond. He knew if he said something, it would only make things worse. He had learned that much already. But Jake wasn't about to let him off that easy. "You know, I don't get it," Jake continued, taking a few steps closer. "You don't even act like you belong here. You think you're better than us, don't you?" His words were harsh, cutting at Malik's very core. "Maybe you should just go back to wherever you came from." The words stung, more than Malik had anticipated. He had spent so much time trying to stay calm, trying to ignore it, but there was only so much a person could take before they reached their breaking point. His fists clenched at his sides, and his breath quickened, but he didn't give in to the anger. Instead, he stood up straighter, lifting his chin, meeting Jake's eyes without fear. "No, I don't think I'm better than you," Malik said, his voice surprisingly steady. "But I'm not going to let you walk all over me anymore." His words were simple, but they carried weight, and for the first time, he felt a sense of strength building inside him. Jake was momentarily taken aback. He wasn't used to anyone standing up to him like this. His friends exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. For a moment, there was silence between them all, like the world had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. But instead of trying to push Malik further, Jake just scoffed, shook his head, and turned to walk away, his friends trailing behind him. Malik didn't let himself relax right away. He had stood up to them, but he knew this wouldn't be the last time they tried something like this. The fact that Jake had backed off didn't mean the problem was solved. It only meant Malik had finally taken the first step in facing the bullies, not with violence, but with words. His words. He didn't need to stoop to their level or use his family's connections to get what he wanted. All he needed was the courage to stand his ground. That afternoon, as Malik walked home, he felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but something had changed. He was no longer the scared kid who would turn away whenever someone looked at him. Malik had found his voice, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own story. When he got home, he sat on his bed, his mind racing. His parents had no idea what he was going through. They had always told him to stay strong, but they hadn't seen what he was dealing with at school. Still, Malik was determined not to let them fight his battles. He wasn't the Mafia boss's son here. He was just Malik, and for the first time, that felt like enough. After Malik stood up to Jake and his friends, he couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. It wasn't just that he'd spoken out. It was the fact that for the first time, he felt like he had control over the situation. He hadn't expected them to back off so quickly, but they did. And Malik realized that sometimes Standing up for yourself was the best way to make people think twice. But even as he walked through the halls the next day, Malik knew this wasn't the end. It never was. The bullies might have backed off for now, but he could still feel their eyes on him, still hear the whispers behind his back. He knew they were just waiting for him to slip up, to show weakness. The pressure was still there, and Malik had to learn how to deal with it. He wasn't sure he had the answers yet, but he was starting to figure out that he didn't have to let them control his emotions. That afternoon, as Malik sat in class, he caught a glimpse of Jake and his friends in the hallway. They were looking at him, talking in low voices. Malik didn't look away. Instead, he kept his focus on the lesson in front of him, determined not to let their presence throw him off balance. It wasn't until lunch that the tension truly hit him. As he made his way to the cafeteria, he noticed that the usual group of students wasn't sitting where they usually did. The cafeteria, usually filled with noise and laughter, felt unusually quiet. Malik couldn't help but wonder if it had something to do with his confrontation the day before. Had they heard about it? Were they avoiding him because they were scared? Malik wasn't sure, but as he walked in and sat at an empty table, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. A few students who had never really paid attention to him before started to walk over, offering small smiles and casual greetings. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Malik feel like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to belong. One girl, a quiet student he'd noticed in class, sat down across from him. "Hey, Malik," she said softly, her voice gentle. "I saw what you did yesterday. That was brave." Malik was taken aback for a moment. He hadn't expected anyone to notice. "Thanks," he replied, his voice quiet but genuine. "I just had enough, you know." "I get it," she said with a nod. "You don't deserve to be treated like that." Malik felt a small but real smile tug at his lips. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, more students started to show him kindness. It wasn't as if they were suddenly his best friends, but the feeling of being acknowledged, of not being invisible, was something new. The bullies, meanwhile, seemed to hold back a little, and though they still shot him dirty looks in the hallways, they didn't approach him like they had before. The change wasn't dramatic. It wasn't as if the entire school had suddenly turned in his favor. But Malik was beginning to understand something important, that his actions had consequences, and they were starting to ripple out in ways he hadn't anticipated. Standing up for himself had not only earned him some respect from his peers, but it had also made him see his own strength in a way he hadn't realized before. As the days went by, Malik started to feel less alone. He still had a long way to go before things felt completely normal, but the pressure was easing. The more he kept his head up and stayed true to himself, the more he realized that he didn't have to be afraid. The bullies couldn't break him, and no matter how hard they tried, they would never make him feel small again. By the end of the week, Malik was beginning to feel like he was part of something bigger. Maybe he hadn't found his place just yet, but he was starting to see that it was possible. And as long as he kept standing tall, as long as he kept his confidence, he knew that he could face whatever came next. The days after Malik's stand against the bullies felt different. It wasn't that everything had suddenly become perfect, far from it, but there was a shift in the way people treated him. For the first time since he'd arrived at the school, he didn't feel like an outsider. There was no magic fix for the bullying, but Malik had managed to prove something, not just to the bullies, but to himself. He had shown that he wasn't someone they could push around, and that realization had a ripple effect. Jake and his friends didn't stop being bullies, of course. They still threw their occasional snide remarks his way, but Malik noticed something in their attitude, a hesitation. They were more cautious now. The loud, mocking laughs had quieted down. The jabs weren't as sharp, and they didn't come as often. Malik wasn't sure if it was fear or simply confusion, but either way, it made him feel stronger. He had set a boundary, and they had taken a step back. But it wasn't just the bullies who had changed. Malik noticed that some of the other students who had once kept their distance from him were starting to warm up. It wasn't anything dramatic, but a few students who had once acted like he didn't exist were now offering friendly nods or smiles when they passed by. The girl from the cafeteria, Sarah, started sitting with him at lunch more often. They didn't talk about the bullies or what had happened. There was no need to. But it felt good to have someone to share lunch with, someone who didn't treat him like he was invisible. One afternoon, as Malik walked to his locker, he overheard a conversation between a couple of students from his class. They were talking about the latest gossip in school, but what caught Malik's attention was the fact that they were talking about him. "Did you hear?" one of them said, his voice low. Malik actually stood up to Jake. I mean, everyone thought he'd back down, but he didn't. He really told them off. Malik's heart skipped a beat. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but hearing this, hearing that other students respected him for what he'd done, felt like a small victory. It was one thing to stand up to the bullies. It was another to have people notice that you weren't just a target anymore. He hadn't expected this kind of attention, but it was slowly making him feel like he belonged. The next day, things felt a little more normal. As he walked through the halls, he noticed fewer stares and more smiles. The whispers weren't gone entirely, but the weight of them didn't press down on him as much. It wasn't that everyone was suddenly his friend, but he had earned something valuable. Respect. He had shown that he wasn't afraid to stand up for himself, and that had made people rethink their assumptions about him. The bullies were still there, still trying to find ways to make him uncomfortable, but Malik wasn't afraid anymore. He had faced them, stood his ground, and emerged stronger. He didn't need their approval. He didn't need to change who he was to fit in with them. The only thing he needed was to stay true to himself, and that had already begun to change everything. By the end of the week, Malik could feel the shift in his confidence. His shoulders were a little straighter, his steps a little lighter. He wasn't invisible anymore. And that small, yet powerful change made all the difference. As he walked home that afternoon, he realized that no matter what happened next, he had already won the most important battle. He had learned to believe in himself. The bullies hadn't broken him. The whispers hadn't defeated him. And from now on, no matter what came his way, he knew he had the strength to face it head on. By the time the school year was coming to a close, Malik felt like a different person. It wasn't that the bullies had completely disappeared, or that everything was perfect. Far from it. But Malik had learned to carry himself with a new sense of confidence that he hadn't had before. The whispers, the stares, the teasing, they still happened, but they didn't have the same power over him. He had stood up for himself and earned something he hadn't expected: respect. It was a Friday afternoon when Malik realized just how far he had come. He was sitting in the library, reading a book he'd been meaning to finish, when Jake and his group walked by. Normally, Malik would have braced himself for another round of insults or dirty looks, but this time, something different happened. Jake glanced over at Malik, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. The tension between them was there, but this time it wasn't full of hostility. Jake simply gave him a quick, almost imperceptible nod before turning away. Malik wasn't sure if Jake had truly changed, or if he was just tired of pushing him around. But in that moment, Malik realized something. He had gained control of the situation. He no longer felt like the underdog, the one always pushed aside. He had earned the respect of the people around him, not just by standing up to Jake, but by staying true to himself through it all. As he walked through the halls that afternoon, Malik noticed a shift in the way people looked at him. It wasn't just Jake and his group, but even the others who had once treated him like an outsider. There were no more sideways glances or whispers. The silence had been replaced with quiet acknowledgement. And that was enough for Malik. It wasn't about being popular or having everyone like him. It was about feeling like he belonged, feeling like he was seen for who he truly was, not just for the color of his skin or where he came from. The bell rang, signaling the end of the day, and Malik gathered his things, preparing to leave for the weekend. As he walked outside, he was greeted by a group of students, some of them new faces, some from his class, who waved at him as he passed. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to make him smile. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the new kid anymore. He felt like he had a place here, a place that was earned through his own strength, his own determination. When Malik got home that evening, his parents noticed the change in him. He wasn't hiding in his room like he used to. He wasn't weighed down by the pressures of school. His mother smiled as he sat at the dinner table, her eyes filled with pride. She had always told him that the most important thing was to stay true to who he was, no matter what the world threw at him. Malik realized now just how much that advice had shaped him into the person he was becoming. That night, as Malik lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened since he first stepped foot in the school. He had faced so much, but he had come out stronger. He had learned that it wasn't the bullies or the whispers that defined him. It was how he chose to respond. He had learned to stand tall, not because he wanted to fight or seek revenge, but because he knew his worth. Malik knew that the challenges wouldn't stop just because the school year was ending. Life was full of obstacles, and he would face many more. But now he knew that no matter what came his way, he could handle it. He had already faced the hardest part, standing up for himself and not letting anyone define his worth. The next day, as he stepped out into the sunlight, Malik walked with a quiet confidence, knowing that he was ready for whatever came next. The journey wasn't over, but he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. He had found his strength, and no one could take that away from him.